How can communities implement better support programs?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. I'm just gonna take a peek here. Yeah, so I think, yeah, so why can't, what can communities do to implement more supports or better support programs? I think, again, it's one of these things that sort of there's not one magic bullet, there's not one kind of program or initiative that's going to kind of save the day. I think it's a number of things. I mean, I think obviously a first step is providing more affordable housing. And so there's different mechanisms for doing that. And there's some debate in the kind of policy world about what are the best mechanisms, but it can be things like rent caps. It can be kind of government built housing. It can be rules kind of limiting Airbnb, right? Because and other kind of rental or kind of short-term rental programs like that, because they take a lot of rental stock off the market. It can be kind of different landlord-tenant rules that sort of kind of limit or kind of help control the number of evictions or how people get evicted. So there's certainly those things kind of help increase people's access to affordable housing. Then I think you sort of also want to be thinking about how you kind of coordinate services. So often, we talk a lot about silos, right? How there's sort of health over here and mental health over here and addictions over here and, housing over here and kind of youth supports over here. And so, that can be really exhausting and very challenging for people to navigate, particularly young people, particularly if you're sort of new to the street. And so it can just really delay how long you can really delay your exit from homelessness and kind of keep you there longer. And then the longer you're there, it gets stickier and stickier and stickier, and it can be harder to get out. So, having a kind of a coordinated system where you're sort of people, service providers and agencies are talking with one another and sort of making sure that access to services is as coordinated as possible can really kind of support people. There's also, so I think, thinking about gaps in service, right? Sort of doing a scan of what kinds of services a community offers, right? Certainly there's places like Toronto where, I'm in Ontario, so Toronto is sort of really well resourced. There's tons of resources. It's not perfect, but there is a lot of resources. But certainly as soon as you kind of get further out, you're going to get fewer resources and they're going to be less specific and less tailored. And so the challenge with that then is that you end up with a lot of young people moving from kind of more rural places, basically moving from their home community to Toronto. And I think that can be positive, but I think most often that can be quite risky for young people. I think because one of the big challenges then is that to make that move, they have to kind of separate themselves from their past support networks. And it's possible those past support networks are kind of in conflict or tenuous and things aren't going that well with those support networks. But I think, we really, as best we can, want to keep those threads connected, right? Even if it's sort of a tenuous thread to a family member or a teacher or a social worker, that thread is really important because when that person needs help, kind of hits that point where they sort of really sort of feel like they need some support, they'll have someone to go to. But if you have a person moving from their home community to somewhere else, all those sort of supports are kind of are kind of cut off. And so it can be harder then to sort of find someone that they trust and sort of make that move maybe back home or kind of back to a safe place in their home community. And so I think, thinking about gaps in service, right? And so there you kind of, and I don't think there's any easy answers, but it's also part of that is thinking about kind of diversity and are you kind of responding to the, the needs of like LGBTQ young people or racialized young people or young people with disabilities. And I know smaller communities aren't going to be able to kind of cater to everyone's needs, but I think you can sort of operate your services in a way that sort of recognizes some of those sort of differences in experience and can kind of account for them in some way. I also think sort of thinking, and I think we're getting slowly better at this, thinking a bit more about prevention. Certainly like, once someone's sort of on the street or street involved or homeless, like I said, it gets sticky quite quickly and it can be hard to move on. So certainly kind of preventing the flow of people into the homelessness sector in your community is really important. So that would mean, for young people, at least we're talking about school-based resources that might sort of help identify young people who are at risk of homelessness and intervene before it's too late. There's family reconnect programs. So if there is a kind of a salvageable connection between a young person and their parent, or a family member or parent, the kind of a social worker or support person can kind of help support that relationship and kind of rebuild it and kind of get them back on track. I mean, that's not going to be sort of a program for everybody. Certainly in the case of an abusive home or anything like that, you don't want to sort of encourage a person to go back to that. But for those young people who sort of, where it's around, conflict or disagreement over rules, and sometimes there can be parents that just sort of want to kick their kid out of the house to like teach them a lesson. And I think we're realizing that's quite a risky strategy because, homelessness can be so sticky. And so things that kind of prevent that from happening, I think are really valuable. And then I think the other thing would be sort of thinking about how to make services as trauma informed as possible. I think that's a really positive kind of development where we're talking more about how trauma works. And so it's getting service providers recognizing that, because sometimes trauma can make sort of people make choices that are hard to understand and so from a service provider, you think like, why isn't this person listening to this perfectly good advice and doing this thing that's right in front of them that's going to make their life so much easier? But if you sort of factor trauma into the equation, you kind of realize that there's probably a lot more going on there. And so I think it can help make the response sort of better sort of suited to that person, and can maybe be a bit of a different response and kind of help them through that moment, or make sure they're getting the adequate supports. And then, I think the last thing to add would be just supports that are aimed at the transition away from homelessness as well. I think those are really important. Just going back to some earlier comments about how getting people into sort of housing or kind of basic stability is important, but it's sort of not the whole story, right? There's that whole bit of how do you kind of move beyond that and get back to school, or get back to work, or for the case of some people, they might need supports for the rest of their life, right? They may not be in a position to work in such a way that they can make a living wage and support themselves. So they might need some additional supports in place. And so, how do you put those supports in place to kind of help people get onto that next phase of life, and sort of find community, find belonging, start working on things like their kind of their self-care strategies and their mental well-being and those things that can be a bit kind of trickier and more elusive for folks. So I think thinking about those supports as well is really valuable.